The 1930s were a time of major change in United States history. The Great Depression caused devastating consequences throughout the decade. Severe drought rendered large parts of the Central Plains a dust bowl, with severe heat waves in the central United States. By 1938, faraway Europe was on a war footing, headlining the news regularly during that year. But along with these concerning thoughts, there were great advancements. Streamlined trains were revolutionizing long-distance transportation with speeds of up to 125 miles per hour. And across the country, with transport from New York to Los Angeles now possible in just 18 hours thanks to the recent launch of the Douglas DC-3, which was transforming air travel. Television was also on the rise, and it was still the golden age of radio. But for the northeastern United States, a rude awakening was on the way, a particular Long Island Express. It's the largest island in the contiguous United States, extending 118 miles from New York Harbor into the North Atlantic Ocean. With its fleet of barrier islands, Long Island is a getaway retreat for those fleeing New York City, whether it's for a day trip, a weekend, or a whole summer. Behind it, the extensive and varied shorelines of Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts, leading out towards Cape Cod. With land temperatures well into the 90s in summer months, sea temperatures catch up in the later part of the summer and early fall, reaching their pleasant maximums in September. One of these barrier islands along the south coast is known as Fire Island and extends by quite some distance along the shore. Within it, Mastic Beach just inland, and that would be the centerpiece of this big event. The whole Long Island and New England coastline was packed with holidaymakers throughout the summer, leading up all the way up until September, and indeed up until the day of the hurricane itself. Equally, New York City was thriving and bustling, with people going about their daily business and seeking recreation by evening. Events would unfold very quickly throughout all of these locations on one day in September 1938.
Okay, my name's Tom Verdi, and I am a freelance journalist. I live in Pawcatuck, Connecticut, which is in southeastern Connecticut on the Connecticut and Rhode Island border in southern New England.
Led in the early 20s to Flint and
in 1938, in the United States, they were, the country was still, in the aftermath of the Great Depression, really still in the throes of it. And so there were hard economic times for many people, but at the same time, there was some recovery on the way. And people in Rhode Island, which is where I grew up, which is where my family came from, where both my grandparents were born, my mother's parents, people in Rhode Island could afford to live in the cities, primarily Providence, which is the capital city, and also afford a small beach house anywhere from 30 to 40 minutes south of Providence along the coast. And that's what my grandparents had. They had a cottage on the beach.
Well, 1938 was definitely a season that was interesting because in post-analysis, they actually revealed that there was a hurricane in January that happened earlier that year. But through the year, August, September, beginning of September, it was just what you'd usually see in the Atlantic, a major hurricane in the Caribbean, maybe one in the Gulf of Mexico, and then just a few junk storms, we call them, tropical storms, just kind of out in the Atlantic. But really no major impacts to at least the continental US up until that point.
Modern analysis has found that the circulation first formed at around 6 a.m. local time on September 9th off the West African coast. A ship report from 12 o'clock that day reported the winds to be at 20 miles per hour and an estimated pressure of 1,007 millibars. The next day, the storm was in the vicinity of the Cape Verde Islands and recorded wind speeds of 35 miles per hour and a pressure of 1,001 millibars. After a few more tropical depression observations on September 11th, the trail went cold for 6 days until the ship Allegret saw it near 21 degrees north, 53 degrees west, and recorded winds of 80 miles per hour and a pressure estimate of 958 millibars.
So looking back at it now through post-analysis, it was likely to become a Cape Verde-style hurricane. That's really given away by the strength at which it was found at in the main development region of the Atlantic.
Connecticut, the Saturday before the storm. It was already reported that torrential rains from unrelated weather were falling in the Connecticut Valley, with the clouds letting loose. At 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time on September 17th, Jacksonville relayed its first radio report about the storm, noting that it was 500 miles northeast of the Leeward Islands.
So the Jacksonville Weather Bureau was initially in charge of the storm. They kept tracking it as it moved north. Now, unfortunately, the Weather Bureau told everybody in the waters from about Miami, Jacksonville area up to Boston to stay out of the water. Now that, on the surface, that's a great thing, stay out of the water. But in turn, that's kind of hurting themselves because now they don't have those ship reports to go off of.
So back then, the U.S. Weather Bureau, as far as forecasting and notifying people, it was much more, we didn't have the advances in technology, obviously, that we have today. There was no satellite, there was no radar. Communications were pretty much limited either by telephone or telegraph, and observations were relayed among the different weather offices. In the case of the 1938 hurricane, it was being tracked by ships and by weather observations over land, but that was really about it. And as the storm progressed off the coast of Florida and eventually up toward Washington, D.C., the expectations were that the storm was going to remain offshore and would miss New England.
By the early hours of September 20th, the hurricane was around 500 miles off the coast of Florida, and a ship called Indian Arrow detected the strongest pressure yet, with a minimum pressure estimate of just under 940 millibars. This information was enough to suggest that the storm had now reached Category 5 intensity.
And that's really going to be the common theme as it works its way up to Long Island. So once it gets above probably that 25-degree north line, or honestly just near the Outer Banks, that's when they start passing the control over to the D.C. Weather Bureau, Washington, D.C. Now, they don't have as much information about the hurricane as the previous Weather Bureau did, but they still know something is out there. But the extent of which, the power of the storm that's out there, they don't have even a nearest clue on how strong that storm is.
What were the people who lived and worked along the northeast coast doing to prepare? Virtually nothing.
The evening of Tuesday, September 20th. The storm was already less than a day away from making its landfall, and finally the first storm warnings got issued by the Jacksonville Weather Office for Hatteras to Wilmington. An hour and a half later, the Washington office issued further warnings from Hatteras to Virginia Capes. And not long after that, the warnings were extended to Atlantic City.
So now what you're going to have is this storm that's kind of being squeezed between the trough over the eastern U.S. and the ridge over Bermuda. And so no meteorologist sees it, except for a few. Charles Pierce from the Boston Bureau actually did see that, but of course, his egos were pretty high back in the day in the Weather Bureau. Senior staff was often very celebrated, very seen everything before. Younger people kind of should stay in their place type of deal.
In the forecast discussions at the time among the team in Washington, his view was kind of discounted, and the official forecast was for the storm to remain offshore. Now, certainly he ended up being correct, and the storm did strike New England, but there really was no advance notice for the residents here of New England or even Long Island, where the storm caused tremendous damage. So by many residents, it was a total surprise, and that led to a very high loss of life.
With the warnings now in effect and advice to ships to stay away from the shore, most ships by 6 a.m. on September 21st, Wednesday, remained in harbour or were far out at sea, away from the storm. However, there was still one ship that was in the direct path of the storm, known as Birmingham City, which at 4 a.m. Eastern Time on Wednesday, September 21st, also recorded a pressure of just below 940 millibars, signifying a very intense storm.
In New England, tropical storms were rarer than palm trees, and the last really powerful hurricane to have struck the area hit more than 100 years before. That was the Great Gale of 1815. There was nobody alive who remembered it.
Cape Hatteras had been reliably warned of the approaching hurricane, and storm force winds surely began by 6 a.m. on Wednesday the 21st. Later that day, as the hurricane would pass to the east, sparing Cape Hatteras and the wider region of the Outer Banks, the highest winds got to 65 miles per hour at the Cape, around about 11 a.m. As the storm passed 75 miles east of Hatteras, storm warnings were then issued for Atlantic City up to Eastport, Maine, and the Washington office produced whole gale warnings for the Virginia Capes to Sandy Hook. Hartford, Connecticut, 9 a.m. on the day of the hurricane. Flood warnings were issued by the Hartford Weather Bureau as flooding was beginning as a result of days of rainfall in the Connecticut Valley. However, there was still no mention of the hurricane in the warnings. At 12 noon on the day of the hurricane, the National Weather Service broadcasted another radio message stating that the tropical hurricane was now in the vicinity of New York, with indications that it would move inland within the next 2 hours and travel up the Hudson Valley or Connecticut Valley. At the same time, midday, tropical storm force winds started in the New York City area and quickly got up to 45 miles per hour. 6 minutes later, Providence, Rhode Island also saw the start of storm force winds up to 45 miles per hour. Meanwhile, Worcester, Massachusetts was already dealing with flooding at the same time, with Mass 9 and US 20 main highways from Worcester to Springfield already closed to flooding, and trains stalled out in the water.
It really wasn't until it was on top of them, if you can believe it or not, because this storm was traveling so fast. Sources vary between 50 and 70 miles per hour. But I mean, like I said, off the Outer Banks at 8 a.m. on the 21st, made landfall on Long Island 3 p.m. So, I mean, within just a few hours, this thing traveled nearly 600 miles.
They said there was warnings, but evidently they weren't anything that any of us would be hearing. As I say, we naturally either have television and radio going all the time, mostly now, but in those days you just tuned it in at night, the news, isn't it?
They look at the sky in the evening before and tap the berm in the morning and see what the sunset looked like and take it from there.
I mean, that's what people listen to. They listen to the radio. And the forecasters back then, they didn't have the kind of, obviously the kind of computer modeling that you have today. They really had no idea of the magnitude of this storm and how quickly it was heading up the coast, and how violent a storm it was. And so they really had very little to no time to evacuate.
Tom's family cottage was located in East Matanook, Rhode Island, on the devastating eastern side of the storm.
My mother wasn't there that day. My mother had a job She had graduated from, well, it wasn't college back then. It was a technical school called the Rhode Island School of Design. It's since now an accredited college, but when she went, it was a technical school, and she was in interior design. And she had a job working for a company that did design work on great big department stores throughout nationally. And so she was in the Midwest when the storm hit. My uncle was there though, that day in the cottage with my grandparents. And when I talked to him about it, he told me that they were listening to the radio, and the report was about Hitler and Neville Chamberlain and the possibility of war in Europe.
12:55 p.m. The hurricane delivers a glancing blow to Atlantic City, New Jersey, where it records a low pressure there of 982 millibars whilst getting 60-mile-per-hour winds sustained. By 1 p.m., the storm was delivering near hurricane force winds to New York City with 70 miles per hour sustained, and at 1:25 p.m. New Haven started to get some storm force winds as well, with a pressure estimate there of 987 millibars. By this point, the center of the storm was located offshore with an estimated pressure of 952 closing in.
Once those hurricane force winds started happening on Long Island's southern shore, I mean, that's when they knew this thing was coming ashore. And by then, what's a warning going to do? I mean, nobody can get out of the way in those conditions. Really a very, very awful situation.
The first indication they had that something was terribly wrong was the sky, the color of the sky. It was kind of he described it as a sort of a sick-looking green sky. It wasn't normal. And then all of a sudden, there was a huge waves.
And many people left safety to drive to the shore to watch what they thought would be an exciting surge. Some never returned.
Block Island, near the eventual landfall site, starts to get hurricane force winds, and they also arrive in New York City at the top of the 2 o'clock hour, and 80-mile-per-hour winds arrive at Providence, Rhode Island. At 2 o'clock that afternoon in Connecticut, a passenger train, the Bostonian, plowed through tangled telegraph wires until a towerman signaled danger ahead. The train managed to stop short of a major weakness in the track that would have caused a major disaster. All the passengers spent a night crammed into 2 of the cars. The train stopped near the town of Stonington, and Stonington and its peninsula, which jutted out into the sea, bore hours the brunt of the winds. Waterfront buildings were smashed apart, and in Mystic, 2 boats out of a fishing fleet of 55 remained afloat by this early point of the storm.
WEEI in Boston, the radio station, they were telling their listeners that a hurricane was going to strike because they've seen what the younger meteorologists were talking about, and they wholeheartedly believed that. So by 2 p.m., you really start to have hurricane force winds on the South Shore. Boardwalks being flipped over, schools being let out early, trees are falling. Basically what you would see near the core of a hurricane.
Well, I heard a crash upstairs, so I went up to investigate, and I found out that one of the large windows had been blown in one of the bedrooms. And I tried to fix it, get something to hold up against it, but the wind would blow everything down, so I just had to give up, and I went downstairs, and by that time the water was on the floor of the dining room, and I thought it was leaking through the windows. And I looked out the window down there, and I see what seemed to be large black birds flying through the air, and it turned out to be the roof shingles.
At 2:43 p.m., New York City recorded its lowest pressure, 973 millibars, as the storm started to make landfall on Long Island out to the east. The 3 o'clock hour was probably the worst hour for the Long Island Peninsula, where hurricane-force winds battered the coast up to 120 miles per hour sustained at Fisher's Island, reported at 3:20. A pressure estimate of 948 millibars was recorded at Babylon, New York at 3 p.m. and major damage was starting to be reported along the coast of Connecticut.
You're going to have houses that are absolutely obliterated, beaches that are obliterated on Long Island's South Shore, and eventually that works its way up to Connecticut only an hour later. By 4 p.m., we have a landfall over New London, Connecticut. Winds are a little weaker at 115, but still a major hurricane. And you have a storm surge, like on Long Island, of about 10 to 15 feet of water.
The storm's impacts first were primarily from high winds, and winds were in excess of 100 miles per hour throughout much of the region. And in fact, the highest gust recorded was at the Blue Hill Observatory, which is located just outside of Boston, Massachusetts, where there was a gust to 186 miles per hour. After the high winds arrived, then we also had tremendous storm surge, and it unfortunately arrived at the same time as high tide, which created a really extraordinarily high and deadly tidal surge.
3:30 p.m. in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Trees went down, ripping up sidewalks as they fell. Streets were flooded, power was gone, houses down or damaged. The Bridgeport-Port Jefferson ferry boat, an old steamer named Park City, never intended to cope with anything rougher than a Long Island squall. Waves drowned her fires, and her engines went dead. With lights out, she drifted helplessly before the storm for the whole night, before being towed by the Coast Guard Patrol Galatea the next morning. Around the same time, cottages were reported shoved half a mile from their foundations in Stratford, and at Savin Rock, one of Connecticut's largest amusement resorts, slipped into the sea. The Thunderbolt, known as New England's most thrilling ride, collapsed, and Wilcox's pier was a ragged line of piles. In Westbrook, Connecticut, 9 people washed up dead. And in West Hampton, at 3:40 p.m., they recorded a low pressure of 952 millibars as the storm continued to push northwards.
So when 38 came ashore, obviously that really high storm surge caused a ton of damage. Houses were instantly obliterated when this came ashore. Beaches, terrain was even altered. A few inlets still stand today from the hurricane. But in terms of those beach houses, very expensive back in the day, absolutely obliterated. So damages throughout New England's South Shore and Long Island came out to roughly over 300 million in 1938 US dollars. I believe that translates to about 5 billion in today's money.
In Old Saybrook, houses moved from their foundations and others were smashed to kindling. And in New London, Connecticut, 4 hours of hurricane-force winds started from 3:30 p.m. The naval anemometer recorded 98-mile-per-hour winds before blowing away. By evening, a quarter mile of businesses were on fire, with winds blowing the stream from fire hoses the opposite direction. Pounding waves of over 8 feet struck the waterfront, and wharves eventually gave way. In Ocean Beach, waves lifted over 50 cottages and tumbled them over end across the main thoroughfare of Ocean Beach.
When this system was racing ashore, it didn't really have the traditional buildup of storm surge like you would see along maybe the U.S. Gulf Coast, where a landfall or close approach, the tide gradually rises. Because the New England hurricane, was moving so incredibly fast, that storm surge, it didn't have time to propagate out ahead of it and cause that gradual rise. Instead, what you had was a landfall, and then right behind the landfall, you had a tsunami-like wave. It's very, very, very scary, actually, that people on Long Island's South Shore, they were in the eye, and they came out of their shelters, their broken houses, and they saw a fog bank right along the horizon. They never seen a fog bank like this before, so dense, moving so quickly. But then they realized their mistake. This isn't a fog bank at all. This is a 15-foot wall of water coming right towards the coastline. So within minutes, that wall of water hits, everything is destroyed. Farther west, obviously, they're on the western side, so they didn't get the winds as bad. But in Battery Park, New York Harbor, the water rose 7 feet in 30 minutes because of just how fast that hurricane was moving. And obviously, you still have water coastline where Rhode Island is. Westerly sees a 14-foot storm surge, wipes out all the houses on Napatri Point, where it remains today just a barren peninsula. Used to be a almost like a Florida Strip type of area for people to get away at. Now it's just barren dunes of a reminder, kind of the power of the 38 hurricane.
As the hurricane roared ashore Long Island, the threat to Tom's family home became more clear.
They knew that they had to get out of there. At least that's what they, that's what any normal person would do, is say, we have to leave. And their house was right on the beach. It was on a dune, right overlooking the water. So they were directly in the pathway of this terrible storm. So they left their house and went down to the main road, and a truck was passing by with some construction workers who had been working on a house down the road. And the construction workers said, get in the truck with us and we'll get you out. So they got in the truck and they drove down the road just a little bit. Now, the road that they were on was the route out of this little community was between the ocean on one side and an enormous salt pond on the other. And so it was a very open stretch of road. There was just no protection whatsoever from the wind or the water or the waves. So these enormous waves came in, a tidal wave really came in, and the wind and the waves overturned the truck, blew everybody in the truck out of the truck.
In Jamestown, Rhode Island, 7 schoolchildren were trapped in a bus and drowned, and the Governor car was also grounded. In Newport, Rhode Island, the roads and beaches offered little resistance as the waves tore at the boardwalk on Easton's Beach. At Bailey's Beach, south of Newport, was devastation, leaving behind only the bathing pavilion in the middle of the road. Third Beach, east of Newport, was swept clean, leaving behind only a fireplace and a chimney stack. The hurricane was a Category 3 on the modern Saffir Simpson Hurricane Scale when it made its landfall, the first one on Fire Island, part of Long Island, cutting it in two. It then moved on towards New Haven, and the difference in time between the first and the second landfall was only around an hour. It was still a Category 3 by the time it made landfall in Connecticut.
Ellery Thompson made his way from Mystic to Stonington, Connecticut to try to save his fishing boat.
Well, I was home there, around noontime on the 21st, and my car was broke down over in Delagrange's garage in Stonington, so I told my mother, I said, I'm going to take the bus to Stonington. And I was lucky to ever get to Stonington, because the storm kept increasing. On the way over, I could see the Mystic River, where the shoreline followed the coast then, and I never saw such savage whitecaps. I said, I never seen them as bad as that. And then at 3 o'clock, I heard this ungodly screech. That was a hurricane, 170 miles an hour, right from 80 to 90. So I got to peek out. So the landlord let me go through his building so I could peek out the front windows. Couldn't see anything, so he had a door there. I could pretty much lost my arm. I opened the door and stepped out into a regular sheltered V. But when I did, the door slammed behind me, and if it ever took my arm off.
My uncle and grandparents were hanging on to a telephone pole, snapping in the wind, like flags. These winds were 100 and I think they were 120 miles an hour. I mean, you can imagine this is an incredible force. And the last thing my uncle heard my grandmother say to him was, take care of your father. Well, another wave struck, and then they were all just scattered. My uncle, he was 16 at the time, by the way, my uncle ended up floating on the roof of an outhouse and was blown several miles inland by the storm. And when all of his clothes, with the exception of his underwear, were just torn from his body, and he was rescued by some people who dragged him out of the wreckage and gave him some hot gin to drink and wrapped him in a blanket, and that was the last he ever saw of his grandparents.
Hundreds of miles north in Winchester, Massachusetts, the winds whipped the usually calm water of a reservoir into a chop and dashed waves up the embankments.
In Middletown, Connecticut, the hurricane arrived at 3:30 p.m., delivering winds of up to 98 miles per hour. 100 families lost their homes in Middletown, with some buildings under 4 feet of water. In East Hampton, all able-bodied citizens fought a bitter 48-hour battle to save the Bevan Brothers Company Dam, which threatened to unleash waters that would wipe the town off the map. At Waterbury, homes were crushed by elms, which were bowled over like tenpins. In New Milford, floodwaters raged over miles of state and local highways and wiped out late crops. The countryside was warned to boil all drinking water to avoid the threat of typhoid. At Hartford, Connecticut, the hurricane arrived from the southeast at 4 p.m., leveling trees and houses and killing 5. 22 were also injured. The grounds of the state capitol were ravaged, and the Connecticut River started to rise at 4 inches per hour. In Worcester, Massachusetts, winds grew fierce by 4 p.m. as well, and it wasn't taken seriously at first until poles began to topple and bricks hurtle through the air. 3 schools were demolished, with 25 students narrowly missing death when a high school roof collapsed. At 5 minutes past 4, Providence, Rhode Island recorded sustained winds of 85 miles per hour, and at 25 past, Worcester, Massachusetts recorded telephone connections snapped and radio stations WORC's antenna was leveled, whilst WTAG continued to function on an emergency backup. The storm was now moving inland, but for many points east, the real storm surge nightmare was about to begin. Back in New London, flames burst forth in a business section near the waterfront at around 4:30 p.m. Flooding short-circuited electric wires and started the blaze. Firemen struggled to cut through fallen trees across the city to reach the fire. Orders were given to summon fire departments of nearby towns, but all telephone wires were down. Trees and debris blocked volunteers setting out in their automobiles to spread the alarm. Shortwave radios sent out appeals over the air, and as darkness fell, fire departments in Quaker Hill and Goshen could see the glare of the fire in the distance, but found it impossible to reach the city. Towns surrounding Boston started to feel the hurricane after 4 p.m. Canton lost centuries-old trees. Medfield saw its church spire impaled into its roof. Many houses in Dedham saw its walls peeled away. Wellesley lost many trees. Newton experienced several days without light or telephones. At 5 p.m., the southwestern shore of Rhode Island was in the teeth of the hurricane. Entire settlements were sucked into the sea, with 445 demolished cottages in the westerly area. In Miscomicot, Rhode Island, 60 houses were submerged. In Providence, when most of the offices let out at 5, flying pieces of roof and other heavy objects were already falling. Most didn't believe that significant flooding would occur until the tide failed to recede during the afternoon. Fields Point was the first place to receive significant flooding, rushing through a large lumber yard. Beyond it, large oil and coal plants were inundated with automobiles and tank cars being pushed aside. Masses of lumber piled up against the Point Street Bridge, and flooding was delayed for a few minutes by the Crawford Street Bridge. After this, most people who braved the waist-high waters were swung off their feet. Many were rescued by ropes thrown out of windows.
The downtown section of Providence, Rhode Island was submerged under 20 feet of water, and there were storm surges all along the southern coast of Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts from the storm.
There are buildings that have plaques on them that show the level of the water. And it's, of course, it's well over your head. I mean, in cases, it's probably up to the second stories of buildings, maybe the third stories of buildings in downtown Providence. Quite high. I mean, you know, you have to get around by boat, you know, in downtown Providence. Cars were, you know, submerged, and but not only, I mean, you have to bear in mind, you got to remember the wind too, you know? I mean, the wind is almost worse than the water in some ways, because the wind not only is, damaging just to buildings that are stationary. I mean, it tears them apart, and it also lifts things up and, tosses them around. So if you look at pictures of Providence in the aftermath of the hurricane, and really all along the coast, there are not only small craft, but large boats. I mean, big boats, big fishing boats, ferry boats, that are inland, that have crashed into buildings, big yachts and whatnot. All these things were just tossed and destroyed. And so it's really, quite dangerous. I also know that the impact of the storm, destroyed many old historic homes in New England that just never came back. Many church steeples in New England were torn loose from the buildings during this storm and were never rebuilt. So there are a great many churches in New England that just have a roof but no steeple. And the church steeple in New England was a very quintessential, architectural landmark.
In Pawtucket, river levels rose to record highs with heavy wind damage, including a clock and steeple from the First Congregational Church into the middle of Broadway. At Woonsocket, wind was ferocious with one fatality and several injuries. Textile workers were dismissed early from mills, with some of these buildings later collapsing. At Bristol, water levels rose 15 feet above normal, destroying the yacht club and throwing around boats. Some rowboats were reported flying through the air and landing on nearby buildings. On Prudence Island, 6 were killed. At Swansea, Massachusetts, the gale-driven tide struck with the same fury that had inundated Providence, killing 6. At Somerset, the oil tanker Phoenix was blown from Fall River and grounded in a backyard off a Somerset home, crushing telephone lines. In Fall River, parts of the City Hall roof were lifted and the local radio station was taken off the air. 12 were killed. In Westport, hundreds of summer homes were destroyed and 23 were killed, with one bridge carried away and another badly twisted. Westport Harbor and Horseneck Beach were the worst affected. Along the 3-mile stretch from West Beach to Barney's Joy, no buildings survived. People in this area were trapped between the onrushing sea and the marshes to the rear. Locals tell of one couple who said they would linger for a last look at the rushing surf for only a minute. Their bodies were recovered 4 days later, along with 12 others.
As far as the storm surge is concerned, Providence did receive the brunt of the impact. However, as far as a larger city area. However, some areas around Buzzards Bay, which is a little bit to the east, saw a storm surge of over 20 feet, and there was quite a bit of flooding is there. But from an impact perspective, as far as a larger, highly populated area, Providence certainly bore the brunt of the storm surge from the hurricane.
The Dartmouth and New Bedford region were inundated by up to 15 feet of water, throwing around scores of small houses and the New Bedford Yacht Club. In Fairhaven, 7 were killed and 1,500 made homeless by 8 p.m. that night. Many were still buried under piles of rubble. In the Harbour View district, houses were smashed to matchwood and flung in all directions. At Sconticut Neck, southeast of Fairhaven and a very exposed peninsula, several summer home owners were killed along the access road as they tried to secure their homes. At Mattapoisett, 300 houses totally destroyed by the tide, which drove high up on the shores, killing 9. In Boston, prior warning from neighbouring areas didn't reach the city in time until the storm struck at around 5 p.m, causing rush hour chaos, smashing scores of windows and throwing trees to the ground. By 5:30, the Merrimack River caused serious flooding in North Chelmsford and then on to Lowell, with many residents fleeing with only what they had on their backs. Back in New London at 6 p.m, hundreds of giant trees snapped and crashed down, dragging with them a tangled mass of wires and blocking all traffic. Every light in the city went out except those in the Mohican Hotel, which had its own power supply. Large stretches of railroad were obliterated east of New London, necessitating an entire rebuilding of the embankment.
New London and Stonington were choked with wreckage and littered with the remains of a large fishing fleet. But the worst destruction of all occurred on the southern beaches of Rhode Island. Nappertree Point had been a delicate spit of land stretching westward from Watch Hill. There was literally nothing left of the dozens of solid homes. Many of these people were swept across the bay to safety, but just as many had drowned.
At Charlestown Beach, Rhode Island, houses were reduced to matchsticks, chimneys tossed hundreds of feet, automobiles raised by the wind and shattered. 50 bodies were recovered the next day. At Scarborough State Beach, Rhode Island, all except one building was completely destroyed. At Wareham, Massachusetts, hundreds of cottages were wrecked in the Swifts Beach area, where 9 were killed. The community of Onset to the east was completely washed out. At Bourne, the tides gained additional height and momentum within the narrow confines of Buzzards Bay, killing 5 in a summer house that was swept along the Cape Cod Canal. From Woods Hole to Chatham, the entire southern coast of Cape Cod was raked by the great storm-tossed tides. Although far from the eye of the hurricane and somewhat protected by the buffer islands of Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket, the coastline was still completely altered at several points, carrying off summer homes and wrecking countless small vessels. The inland town of Ware was already flooding when the hurricane tore into town. The fire station collapsed and many houses caved in. The Ware River leapt its banks and the town was cut off from the outside world. 600 families were made homeless and the town relied on airplane drops containing bread and typhoid serum. The town was without power, light, telephones, or roads. The city of Springfield, Massachusetts was already at flood level when the hurricane arrived. 8-foot waves whipped up the Connecticut River, sweeping away bridges, highways, trains, and 16,000 trees. Giant 100-year-old elms smashed into houses, fell across power lines, crushed automobiles, and stopped traffic. At Chicopee, floodwaters rolled through the industrial center, and 8 square miles of the region were under 5 feet of water or more. All women and children were evacuated from the most vulnerable areas by midnight. At Holyoke, damage to waterfront mills was extensive, and 400 families were evacuated. Northampton was battered by the wind and later swamped by flooding. Rural districts around Hadley were staggered by the damage inflicted upon the crops and their buildings. 60% of the tobacco sheds in the area were flattened, with major losses in the onion crop, apples and peaches. At Southbridge, all roads were underwater and a dam burst inundated the center of town. At East Brookfield on the banks of Lake Lashaway, it was cut in 2 and a woman was killed. 1 building also caught fire. The Nashua River was already swollen when the hurricane hit Fitchburg. 5,000 trees fell amongst the roaring winds whilst the town was threatened by a potential dam failure. At Athol, further upstream, townspeople realized only too late that flooding was imminent and waters crashed through the Starrett Dam. High winds took out power and the National Guard was mobilized. At 6:10 p.m, Mayor William Bennett appealed for the National Guard and warned the public to stay off the streets of Worcester and watch out for live wires. At 6:30, water levels returned to normal at Newport, Rhode Island, and at 6:47 p.m, East Boston Airport recorded a wind speed of 100 miles per hour. Rumours spread rapidly throughout the evening that the lower parts of the Cape had been blown into the sea, that Boston was inundated, and that thousands were dead. With no power, telephone, or drinking water, Cape Cod residents spent the evening terrified. In New Hampshire, it was estimated that 6 years' worth of timber cuts were felled by the hurricane in the state. By 8 p.m, dams failed at Deering and North Weir, northwest of Manchester, carrying away more than a dozen bridges along the Piscataqua River. 4 women on the North Weir Bridge perished when it caved in. The state capital, Concord, was already battling floodwaters when the hurricane arrived. Power was out, and later in the evening all roads were cut off by fallen trees or deep water. Trees as old as 500 years collapsed. At Peterborough, winds and flooding gave way to firefighting as the evening wore on, with a grain storehouse combusting. Several other buildings were burned to the ground, with fire crews unable to reach the area due to flooding. Many buildings were saved, owing to them being drenched with water by the storm. At 8:10 p.m, the National Guard took control of Worcester, Massachusetts. By that point, 4 were killed in total. In Springfield at 8:30, the mayor spoke over the radio with transportation paralyzed and no way in or out of the city, and informed the public that the storm damage had been heavy, but that the Connecticut River was starting to lower. At Provincetown at 9 p.m, fishermen warned that it would not survive the high tide which was due in at 10, but fortunately the storm was spent by the time high tide came in. The town suffered comparatively minor damage. In today's terms, by this point the storm had turned extratropical over New England, and it was now starting to move towards the northwest. It still contained winds at this point of 70 miles per hour. By 9:30, the Connecticut River surged on at Springfield, and the mayor broadcast orders to evacuate the south end, which was completed by midnight. At 11 p.m. in New London, firefighters prepared to dynamite parts of the city to create a fire break, but winds then veered and swept back over the smoldering area, preventing further loss. The storm continued to weaken into Canada overnight, and by morning it became clear the amount of damage that was wrought across the whole New England region. Rare color video showed the scene from Foxborough, Massachusetts. Flooding continued in parts of Vermont, as well as many other locations further south. The ordeal was over for the coastal communities of Connecticut and Rhode Island, but many people were lost.
My mother was, as I say, was in the Midwest, and she, of course, when she heard about it, and again, it was hard to get word out there too, but she ultimately, heard news, and so she headed east to see if my grandparents were alive or not. Well, it was about a week until they discovered, it was either my grandfather or my grandmother, pardon me, I can't remember who was found. I think it was my grandfather they found first. They found his body, and then about a week later, they found my grandmother. And the person who found my grandmother took her her engagement ring, a diamond ring that she wore, and he gave it to my mother. And my mother wore that ring forever, ever after. I mean, I never saw her without it on her finger. And the ironic tragedy of their experience is that their cottage was one of the very few houses on that beach that withstood the storm, but it had been completely turned around on its plumbing. Nothing in the house had been disturbed, my mother said. She saw my grandmother's knitting on the bed. There was a fish in a frying pan that my grandmother was cooking for lunch when the storm hit. And so if they had stayed in the house, they would have survived. I think it was mixed. I mean, there were people who rebuilt and came back. And, obviously in the cities, they needed to rebuild and get life back to normal as it could be. But there are other parts of the coast where they didn't. And where the landscape was so altered that it was either impractical to rebuild or financially inadvisable, or for instance, very close to me, 10 minutes away, is a spit of land called Napatree Point, and that is now it's a nature preserve. It's a beautiful coast. It's a beautiful arc of a beach that extends from a place called Watch Hill, and this is the westernmost part of Rhode Island. That peninsula had been covered in houses completely. If you can imagine, it was a beautiful arc, very much like where my grandparents had lived. A community with cottages right on the beach, and all of those houses were wiped out, just blown away. And if you go to Napatree Point today, at the beginning of it, right where it joins the mainland, you'll see the remnants of a crumbled tarmac road. And that was the main road that went out to the point.
Thursday evening, the day after the storm, at Willimantic, Connecticut, with roads blocked by tree trunks, the town faced complete isolation when the Bolton Notch Dam burst. The Willimantic River poured millions of gallons of water into the area, prompting an emergency declaration. Food supplies were airdropped on Friday. Waters on the Connecticut and Park Rivers only peaked 2 days after the hurricane, putting parts of Hartford city streets under deep water of up to 10 feet. 1,000 volunteers put together a levee along a half-mile of the river in less than 24 hours. The Red Cross reported that 7,000 people had been removed from the city. On October 4th, 2 weeks after the storm, the town of Stonington, Connecticut, got its rail line back online. The first through rail was finally completed on a single track and continuous service was re-established. 30 miles of track had to be relayed, and it took over 293 hours of day and night labor. So the final numbers from the hurricane, at least what we know about: $306 million in damages in total, 800 fatalities, 52,550 buildings damaged, and 4,500 destroyed. 708 were injured in the storm, and several thousand evacuated. The storm peaked with winds of 160 miles per hour and made landfall with winds of 120 miles per hour, with a pressure estimate at 940 millibars. One of the most common questions that are asked about historic storms like these are, what would happen if the storm arrived today?
So if a hurricane like the 1938 hurricane occurred today, we here at the National Weather Service would have much better ways to monitor the storm and predict the storm and give people ample notification of its potential impacts. First of all, today we have satellite, so we'd be tracking the storm as it was out over the open Atlantic. We have coastal radars, which can give us precise locations on the center of the storm, as well as some of the intensity with the wind. We're able to measure wind speeds with Doppler radar. The weather models that we have today, I think would be very, very accurate in showing the track of the storm, not only several days in advance, but as it got closer to the coast, where exactly landfall would occur, Where would the greatest wind impacts occur? Where would the greatest storm surge occur? So we have so many advances in technology, including radar, satellite, and modeling, that we would have a pretty good idea of where the storm would be going and where the greatest impacts would be felt. And of course, today we also have much better communication systems. We're not limited to telephone or telegraph like back with the 1938 hurricane. So not only do we have the broadcast media on television and radio, we have the internet, we have social media, we have other ways of getting information across. We have wireless emergency alerts on cell phones when needed for things like storm surge, extreme winds, flash flooding that are all associated with hurricanes. So, much better advances in technology would not, minimize the impacts necessarily, but would certainly allow people to be more prepared for this storm days in advance.
Now, if that same storm happened again today, obviously you've seen the metropolis that New York City is, and Long Island. It's the Gold Coast, really, of houses, bunch of mansions on southern Connecticut shoreline. If this storm happened again today, not only would you see that damage that you saw in 1938, but you would see massive loss of life, just due to how populated it is. And not to mention the tree damage as well. New England, as you can imagine, has a ton of trees. And roughly 5% of New England's trees fell that day, just across the region, up from Connecticut to Vermont. So it was a very human cost, and it was also a very nature cost as well, when you have all those trees downed.
Since the hurricane of 1938, this section of the United States coast has been visited again by a few more hurricanes, mainly in the 40s and 50s. Aside from Hurricane Bob in 1991, this part of the coast has been relatively untouched in recent years. Will that change? Of course it will. But the question is, when?
That it is a part of their family's history and a part of really of New England's identity.